Hi there.
Good
Hi.
morning, good afternoon.
Can you
How
hear
are
me
you,
okay?
Alexander? Can hear you well. I
Okay.
think we are already with our uh, audience right
Oh,
now.
wonderful.
So they just watched a video. So we apologize for the technical glitch that we had. But now, on the bright side, you are able to keep that link to the video and watch it at your own time. So I'm really pleased to welcome Maestro Alexander Shelley with us tonight. Thank you
Hi.
so much for being with us. It's such a special and unique time.
It's
And
my great
I
pleasure.
was just thank you. I was just remembering about a year ago we were together with OCS and a number of singers
Mhm.
performing Verdi's Requiem in Ottawa and in Kingston.
I
It's crazy
know.
to think how time have changed and how things are different now. So how have you been coping with the past 6 months?
Well, before I tell you about the last 6 months, may I pay you my compliments on the video because I was sent a link
Oh,
to it, so I wasn't able to watch it live just now, but I watched it all in full earlier, and I think it was just a beautiful and very well articulated introduction to the piece. I found it fascinating and engaging, and I know the piece very well and have studied it in depth. So really, my compliments because it was a
thank
beautiful
you.
production. Um,
Thank you.
well, I'm speaking to you from Ottawa. And we
Wonderful.
got back
Welcome.
here about, thank you. We got here about 10 days ago. So we've been quarantining. I say we, my family travel with me. So this has been, a new experience in the last few months because the rest of it, we were in London, our other home, London, England. Um, when lockdown began, or when things started to happen, I was actually on tour down in Australasia. I had a week in Melbourne, where I'd done a nice program, a world premiere of a piece by an Australian composer, then a Grieg a piano concerto, and then Ein Heldenleben, which is a great piece, which is Strauss, very big, and sort of ridiculous when looking back on it, how many people were able to be in the same space.
Right.
And then I went on to Sydney and I did a few programs. And already in Sydney, though, there was a sense that it was getting serious. We did 5 performances, and across the performances, we could see there was a slight change in the number of people that felt comfortable coming. And then I was supposed to go to New Zealand, and I did travel. I spoke to the orchestra. I said, "Are you sure about this?" And they said, "Yes, we're planning to do the concert." So I flew across to New Zealand, got off the plane, went to my hotel room, and I turned on the news, and it said, all these airlines are closing down flights and countries are closing borders. So it was chaotic evening, but I rebooked and came back to London, and we were there for 6 months. And um, uh, it sounds sometimes wrong to talk about silver linings because it's just an awful situation for everybody.
Indeed.
So many people have been suffering with their health, of course, but also economically in every other way. But I would say that the silver lining for me, if I can see one, is to have had time with our little boy because he turned 2 during the time we were together, and
Ah,
and that was a gift that I don't think I would have had otherwise. So that's my silver lining.
wonderful. I think that's a great thing. We all are somewhat grateful to have been able to reconnect with other things that we usually don't have a chance.
Mm.
Right before we started the presentation at 7, I played some music that you recorded with the NACO Orchestra,
Oh, great.
Brahms, Schumann, and Clara Schumann, Robert and Clara Schumann. Such a wonderful trio that is really apropos with our
Mm.
topic tonight. So, what is the relationship with the music of Brahms?
Well, um, it's a bit like, I mean, I was going to say for every musician, but I can't speak for everyone. But I find that Brahms, a bit like Bach, is someone who is kind of the truth in music. So when I talk about my relationship to him, there is, I can't think of a note of Brahms that isn't somehow poignant and in its way perfect. Maybe even more humanly perfect than Bach. Bach is so extraordinary in the sort of perfection of his creative capacity, and the flow that he had, the unending number of works that he wrote, that he can almost seem superhuman.
Mhm.
Um, but with Brahms, there is a deep humanity, but in his real humanity, there is a perfection of construction, but also for me, probably more importantly, although we can talk about how those two things go hand in hand, of expression. And so I think he's somebody who I always revel in learning his music, because the experience just sitting at a table quietly with the scores is unimaginably fulfilling. And that's a very special privilege that those of us who whose lives consist of going very deeply into music, be it a musicologist or be a performing artist, or let's say an amateur who just finds the time and makes the time to do it. That's a particularly unique privilege, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily get. They think, okay, music is for listening to. But as you so eloquently, made clear in the video that everyone was just watching, there's layer upon layer upon layer of the cerebral element that one can get into, not just the contextual, but then also the construction, the architecture of music. And something that became clear to me, as it does with many, many people, it's not new to me, but what became clear to me when I first became good at analyzing music and understanding how it's put together, is that expressive content and the craftsmanship of a work are completely linked. And that is a very interesting lesson for life. And of course, when you start to look for it, you see it everywhere. So there's plenty of mathematicians and people who are involved in geometrics and in physics and architecture who've noticed the same thing, that in nature, there's leaves behind you there. Leaves are a perfect example. In leaves or in waves or anything else, you encounter fractals, you encounter geometry, which itself expresses beauty. And so without wanting to get too intense immediately, that is something that is at the core of who Brahms is as well. It is that craftsmanship and that perfection.
Do you find that your approach to Brahms' music is different when you work, let's say, with his symphonies? You recorded Symphony No. 1 on your last CD, and let's say the Requiem, which I think Symphony No. 1 came after the Requiem, I believe.
It did, yeah.
Yeah, it did. So what is the difference in your approach?
I liked the way you started the video, by the way, when you point out, because I think it's very important that people think of Brahms with the big beard, just sort of sitting there. But like you say, he was this dashing, handsome young man. Not that it's important that he was dashing or handsome, but what's important to remember is that he was young. And he must have been in his no more than his late 30s when he finished all these versions of the Requiem that you talked about. I think he was probably 37 or 38 when that final premiere happened with all 7 movements. And yes, he was a little bit older when his first symphony first came out. But to answer your question, the analytical process is identical. So I will spend the same time looking at how the piece has been put together, the nuts and bolts, so the harmonic construction, and as you beautifully also pointed out, what is the sort of meta architecture of the piece? So that movement from F through E flat and then back again in this case, or in the first symphony from C minor to C major, and what happens in between. And then what you start to notice with someone like Brahms is that from those grand architectural shapes, you reduce down, and it turns out, just like with Beethoven, that the DNA also contains, so the smallest elements of the music also contain some of those steps. The most famous example in Beethoven being the Fifth Symphony, So I analyze it in the same way and go through that sort of musical analytical stage. But of course, the difference is text. And looking at relationship between music and text, and also the text in itself. And again, I keep saying it, but you spoke beautifully to that. I mean, this is an extraordinary piece of music, the Requiem, in that it sort of redefines what a Requiem is. And I think that's what draws me so strongly to the piece. But I would point out, I find it quite fascinating listening to you. And you say that journey from F to E flat, for example, is unexpected and unusual. But what I find is always interesting for us with pieces that we know well is not just to think like that, but to remind ourselves of first impressions. It's so hard to have a first impression when you know a piece.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
the Requiem starts off with just these low Fs, these 4 Fs.
Mm-hmm.
You think, okay, so what's going to happen now? We don't have a tonality. We don't know if it's F major or F minor. We just hear these
That's right.
Fs. But the first thing he does is he adds the 7th above it. So, for those listeners who sort of understand what I meant by that, we go for F and then we have an E flat, which is, of course, creating the outline of a 7th chord. And for everyone who doesn't know what the hell I'm talking about, what that note does, the E flat, is suddenly in your mind, no matter who you are, it says you're going to go somewhere different. So that you started with an F, but that E flat is a note that leads you in another direction. And in bar 3, we're already in B flat major. So we haven't even had F major. We've gone through an E flat in the second bar, and then we're suddenly in B flat major. Now, what is so interesting, firstly, is by bar 3, he's already reached the tonality where if he plays a 7th, we're in E flat major. So he's done it within 3 bars, right? He's helped us solve that conundrum of how he got to E flat major. But more importantly, perhaps, is that for me, in those first 3 notes, F, E flat, and then the D, which implies the B flat major, he's done what perhaps a requiem needs to do. A requiem is a transition between this life and something afterwards. And it is, of course, for the people who survived, because, well, depending on your frame of reference and what you believe, probably the person who's passed is not experiencing the requiem themselves. It's a requiem for the person's life. But what it does is in the first 3 bars, it sets up this idea of transformation and transfiguration in a very profound way. But the thing is, I always forget it too, right? We're like, okay, well, this is the beginning of Brahms' Requiem. This is what happens. But that unexpected nature,
Right.
I think, must have struck people at the very beginning. He doesn't establish a tonality properly for a few bars. And that's very beautiful. And it's very Brahmsian as well.
Exactly. I mean, every time I think about this beginning, it reminds me of Beethoven's First Symphony, starting on the one chord. And I'm thinking, I'm pretty much sure the audience must have been shocked when they first heard it. But that's
Starting
impossible now to
dominant 7th.
Yeah, who would do that, right?
Yeah.
But that's impossible to unhear all of what we've heard in the past 200 or 300 years. So that's hard to be authentic in our listening.
Exactly. And the other thing that I enjoy very much about the way you spoke about the piece was you spoke about what came before. You know, you alluded to the fact that the Fauré Requiem was written only shortly afterwards, which is, by the way, another surprising thing about Brahms. When we were doing the recordings that you mentioned, Schumann First Symphony, Clara Schumann Piano Concerto, and then Brahms First Symphony, which is part of a cycle. We're going to be doing all the 4 symphonies from both of those composers, so the 8 symphonies plus lots more music by Clara. One of the things I like to mention to anybody, audiences or orchestras, just to remind them, is that between Robert Schumann finishing his 4th symphony and Johannes Brahms starting his First Symphony, or premiering his First Symphony, Richard Wagner wrote the entire ring cycle. Now, you see, setting it in context like that is quite extraordinary. You can see why people sometimes thought of Brahms as looking backwards. Because and think of Fauré Requiem, it's a different language. And think of what's to come with Verdi quite soon. They are, in inverted commas, more overtly progressive. Now, actually, when you get into the inside of the piece, Brahms is unbelievably progressive in his thinking and his harmony and everything else. Yes, so that's I don't know why I'm talking about this now, but I just went there.
Brahms is exactly. You know, we often talk about Brahms' Requiem as being a human requiem, being almost humanistic. And I think, that's always a term that scares me, because I'm thinking if it's human, it needs to be relevant even today when we perform it. So what is your approach when you perform a piece like Brahms' Requiem to connect it with the current world, trying to make sure it speaks?
I suppose I'm old-fashioned, and maybe it's to do with the work that we're in. But you notice when you spend your time performing music from people who are alive and people who are no longer alive, from up to 600 years ago, what you start to notice is that no matter what we say And of course, this is depending on your opinion, and everybody can believe what they feel passionately about. But for me, the human condition is simply the human condition, and it is of no real relevance where you were born or when you were born. The same questions, the same emotions, the same highs, the same lows are experienced, and so individuals like Brahms, who spend a great deal of time refining their skills, so refining their way of communicating their feelings to us and communicating their thoughts in a language which is so wonderfully non-verbal. You can still spend a lot of time studying it to learn the language, but somebody who doesn't know the language can, as you said, you can hear it and you can maybe be moved. I agree with your differentiation between the words hearing and listening. And it's sometimes frightening for people, because one of the predicates of music is almost, well, I should be able to just listen to it and not understand anything. And I get that. I know absolutely why someone says that. And it's like, I really enjoy listening to some languages that I don't speak. I think Arabic can be an unbelievably beautiful language just to listen to, but I don't understand a word. And it's an imperfect analogy, but it is still an analogy that is not far from the truth, that you can listen to a piece of Brahms and love the sound of it, but you can then start to really dig into his language. And that, anyway, I don't want to go on about it, but that language will also change from piece to piece. And that's the other interesting thing, that the world that a composer decides to inhabit is created within that work. And sure, there may be similarities from work to work in their language, but anyway, the humanistic element, I'm not frightened by it. I'm very drawn to it. His very bold decision to with the choice of text, to focus on God rather than on the Holy Trinity, and to basically leave Christ out of it, is perhaps something that is shocking for people at the time, although people didn't profess a huge amount of shock. They kind of said to him, maybe you could do it differently. Yeah. But the God that he depicts in his Requiem it could almost just be the God within yourself, whatever that means, but that sense of a centering force that we all have, perhaps, of that thing or that voice in our minds that differentiates between good and bad and tells us the things that we know deep down. It could be as much that as it could be the Lutheran God that he was ultimately referring to from the texts. But I think that was very conscious, and it's quite North German. Some of my closest friends, my flatmate for 5 years when I was studying was from Rendsburg up in the north near Flensburg, which is a sort of harbor, and they're very pragmatic people. There's not so many bells and smells as you have in the Catholic Church, and mysticism. It's more kind of straight ahead, and I can see, even though it's a bit of a reach, comparing across a century like that, but how Brahms was also that person. He was very human, very soulful, very centered. But I think the human condition was almost enough for him. I don't think he needed to delve deeply into any kind of mysticism. If you'll excuse me using the word mysticism for this liturgy, I don't mean that in any pejorative way.
Every time I've seen you work with a choir, I've been so impressed by how much you are at home working with voices. So I'm assuming you've probably conducted or sung even with a choir in the past. So what is your experience working with choirs?
So as a singer, I went through a very English kind of school system up until I left for Germany, which was when I was 18. And singing was at the heart of a lot of what we did. So I was in the choirs from a young age at school. I went to a very old school in London from the age of 12 till 17 called Westminster School. And we had 4 times a week, we had a service in Westminster Abbey, and I sang there. Now there's actually the Westminster Choir School, which is just a choir school, which is not where I went. And they wear the ruffled, you see them on TV at Christmas time. But I went to the other school. And so singing was part of my life, my daily bread. I was not a great singer. I was a competent singer, and I enjoyed singing in choir. But I mean, I'm glad to hear you say that. I find there's so many aspects of singing that, if one thinks about music and cares about it, they're so eminently natural. First of all, the question of putting sound to text is so sort of fundamental to who we are, and indeed, so many things that we extrapolate from harmony, I have read, and I think it sounds plausible, are ingrained in us because we also have associations, a lot of it through the church, of how certain words were sung to certain harmonies. Like the idea of an amen being in a cadence is very much woven into aspects of our culture. Those of us who engage with that sort of music. So they're inextricably linked. And I find that it tends to be an enormous privilege to be able to take the concrete word that has inspired a composer and to witness in unequivocal terms, you know that they are setting this word, to witness how it inspires them to music. And so I find it's a very special relationship, because in other areas, in abstract music, let's say just symphonic music, you can guess at a program, and sometimes it's written, and you can imagine this is the bird, or this is this feeling, or this is that feeling, but it's a guess. With text, you have this unequivocal, and I love that. And I love also language. Actually, one of the hesitations I've always had, particularly in opera, because I've conducted opera in French and Italian and German and Danish and English, is that I'm very, very, very aware of when I don't know a language well. And I find it almost wrong to be conducting a piece. I don't know how to explain it. When I have recitative in Mozart, because I'm not a fluent Italian speaker, I feel really wrong telling anybody else how to do it, because text, understanding the connotations of words, of how they fall within a sentence. I mean, anybody understands this, right? That you can hear a non-mother tongue speaker within a second, just the tiniest nuance. And so, as a conductor, I always find it very awkward. I want, whenever I prepare anything, to really have a deep understanding of everything I do. It's kind of the control freak, I guess, in all of us. And so that question of relationship to language, I've always found, on the one hand, exciting, on the other hand, very challenging. And so English and German, I'm completely fine, because they're my sort of mother tongues. And I suppose French would be my next best language. And in terms of pronunciation and sound, that's all great. But again, that closeness to the nuance of text, I miss. And funnily enough, maybe after English and German, Latin would be the next best, because it is more distant for all of us, right? So I feel more on an even footing there. So the other requiems that are in Latin, for example, or some of the liturgical works. Anyway, so
indeed,
yeah.
So how do you maybe even change the way you rehearse or conduct when you work with a chorus? Because clearly, working with a chorus, the way of working, the traditions are always a bit different than what the orchestra would have. So do you change the way you conduct, the way you rehearse when you have a chorus in front of you with the orchestra?
Well, interestingly, I think very frequently, not always, but very frequently, choruses are amateur, and they can sing at an incredibly high level, but it's not their main job. There's some exceptions. I've worked with some radio choirs in Germany. It's one of the last places where you really have radio choirs who are there all day. Now, the reason I mention that is that sometimes I surprise myself and think to myself, I should do this more generally, which is that I'm more aware of the fact that people are there because they just want to be there, and they're excited about the music, and they're doing this outside of their work time. And so I talk maybe a little bit more about motivation behind the music, not how do people motivate themselves, but the motivation behind the music, and maybe have more fun with that aspect of it, talking about what a composer is trying to achieve. And of course, it is a little bit more easy in vocal music because it's there in black and white. It's like, well, this is the story, and you can talk about different aspects of it or nuances, but there is the advantage that it is pretty unequivocal what's going on. And in contrast with an orchestra, it's always professionals, unless I'm with a youth orchestra, in which case I also find I work a little bit differently. But I was trained very much to be sort of hyper efficient with time with orchestras. Not that I ever try and be anything other than efficient with choirs, but it means maybe I speak a little bit less and talk less about motivation, because sometimes with someone who's been doing it for 35 years every day, you know, sitting there playing away, they don't need to hear from you again how great Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is. They want
Right.
And that sounds awfully cynical. I'm not cynical. And I also wouldn't want to say that symphony orchestras are cynical. It can happen, but generally they're not. But I do notice a difference. And I do sometimes, like I say, chastise myself. I say you should bring more of that attitude to orchestral rehearsals, because it is nice, even if it's sometimes, you know, you speak 1 minute longer than you should, it's still nice, you know.
Have to tell you that, you know, I'm sure all the singers really enjoy when you come in and work with us and tell us about how you see the music and, you know, what is the story that you see behind it. Talking about the choristers, I think we have a few questions that they were able to put in the chat that I'll be able to ask you on their behalf. So if you still want to put a question in the chat, you can do so, and I can ask them to our guest tonight. There's Sharon who's asking us, which sections of Brahms' Requiem do you find the most difficult to conduct?
Oh gosh, I haven't conducted it since 2017, so I'm trying to think back. Difficult to conduct. That's an interesting. It's also an interesting question, because it can mean lots of different things. It can mean, do you find it technically difficult to conduct? Or do you find the music so difficult to comprehend and to make it gel? The answer I can give is that with large scale works like the Requiem, the architecture, which I alluded to earlier, the sense of pacing across movements, and how to create a cohesive experience for listeners and performers. I would say that is always the greatest challenge with big works like that. And I know that Sharon asked for some specifics, and I apologize for not giving those. But I would say that with all of the Requiems, that's front of mind when I start. It's kind of the final note. And interestingly with the Brahms, you know, there's that final. It must be about 12 bars before the end, the final forte. You want to give the impression to an audience member that first note arrives and concludes on that forte 12 bars before the end. That in that moment people kind of look back to the beginning and go, oh, or they feel it. And that's quite difficult to achieve. And so if I'm worried about anything, it will be that normally.
That's a big thing. That's a big challenge. Maggie here is asking us, can you tell us about the first time you conducted Brahms' Requiem?
Oh, that was in Nuremberg with my orchestra over there, the Nuremberg Symphony Orchestra. I think it must have been around 2010, something like that. And we did it in a couple of venues. We did it, I think, in the Meistersingerhalle, which is the main concert hall there, which was built in the late 1950s, early 1960s. As much was there because of the destruction. And it's, even though I spent 10 years of my life giving concerts there, it's not one of the great concert halls. It looks amazing. It seats 2,500 people. And it's quite dramatic, but it's quite a dry acoustic. And you do, you know, Brahms premiered this piece in a church, several different churches, Leipzig and Bremen before that. And you do want that sound that sort of envelops you, that you almost hear things ringing on afterwards. And we didn't have that. But then we went to a local church, a very big cathedral, in fact, and performed it a few days later. And that was a completely different experience. And what I would mention, and again, so many of the listeners are singers themselves who've performed in many different acoustics. But I like to remind audiences that the venue will dramatically alter how a piece sounds, and therefore how we perform it in the moment. But also the audience does, and that's, looking forward to the coming months. That's something I'm fascinated to see, is how the absence or the great reduction in the number of audience members is going to affect how we make music. And that's also one of the great beauties of live music, is that no matter what people might think when they come into the hall, it is a communal experience. And the act of listening to it and the act of knowing that someone is listening while we're playing changes the moment. So one cannot happen without the other. You can't hear a recorded version and have the same experience, and neither can we.
That's right. We have two questions around the same topic, and I'm not sure if they are about my presentation but I think I would need your help to answer them. Paul and Francis are asking about the E-flat major key of that central movement in the Requiem. And Francis is asking, we also have E-flat in a number of pieces. We have it in Elijah, and often seen as a key of comfort.
Yeah.
You see,
well, it's also
in some.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it's weird how certain keys are. I like E-flat major to play on the piano. To improvise an E-flat major is a very nice thing. Things lie nicely under the fingers, and across the ages, different keys have had explicit and different meanings, and some of this is connected back to the time before keyboards were tempered and the sound of certain keys. But particularly with E-flat major, there is the relationship to the Holy Trinity, and above and beyond that, there's also the association with Freemasonry in Mozart. So
right.
Here, help me. The Magic Flute
right.
is full of threes. The three
Threes.
flats, the E-flat major, the three knocks, and so on and so forth. So
exactly.
It is. Composers spend their lives dealing with symbols, whether it's the whole notes and half notes and keys and relationships between
exactly
things. They live and die by symbols, and so E-flat major might seem innocuous to some of us, but it carries a great tradition.
Exactly. And then to follow up, Paul is asking, how many people are actually catching that when they listen to the piece? How many people in the audience are aware of all these details? And that kind of goes with one of the early comment that you made in terms of listening and hearing.
Yeah. I would say if you imagine going to a museum, or let's go to an art gallery, you will walk into the first couple of rooms and you'll look at the images on the wall and take them in, and then you'll walk into the next couple of rooms and look at the images and take them in, and you might walk out and say, okay, that had this impression and that had this impression on me. Then I could go in with the curator and speak to her about it, and she might point out that they had dimmed the lighting and used more blue in the lighting for the first two rooms, and they brightened the lighting and used more red in the third and fourth rooms. And then you look at it and you go, oh yeah, I didn't even realize that, but I felt it. I noticed that the mood in this room was this, and the mood in that room was that. And that's what tonality does. And you played the end of the movement that comes prior.
Right.
And not that people need to focus on it when it happens, or that they never necessarily even register it consciously. But the shift in tonality is actually one that really brightens suddenly the mood, as if you've walked into a brighter room.
Right.
And he's moving there, as you mentioned, from a dark theme into a light theme. This idea of the eternal comfort, in a bright sense of comfort, of blue sky, and that he achieves with that unusual move in the tonality. And of course, one of the words I'd use to describe Brahms is that he is almost always a red wine and very rarely a white wine, if ever. So even within a bright tonality, it's still Brahms. So you feel this velvet, and he does it in these little turns of harmonies. So even the brightest sky is never really too bright with Brahms. He said, "Inside I never laugh." I always find that a sad quote from him. He said, "Inside I never laugh." What was it? He said, "Life robs us of more than death does." Those are two quotes from him, and I don't think he was I mean, by definition, he must have been a little bit sort of cynical and pessimistic if he said those things, but I don't associate it with him. And yet, when I think about it, Mozart has wit and humor in his music. He brings a lot of other things as well. But actually, humor, real like sort of witty humor, is not something you really come across in Brahms. You come across lightness, and you come across gentleness and fun sometimes, but wit in the way that the Mozart you don't come across. And I think that's something that sort of defines him in a way. He's a very he's a red wine, you know.
We all love red wine.
Yeah.
I love the image of the light that we perceive that affects us, but that we don't really always understand or process. Yeah. But it does affect us quite a bit. Thank you for that. There's a question from MB Garneau, who asks, there are so many requiems out there, so many, and most of the well-known repertoire for orchestra and chorus is often requiems. Verdi, Britten, Cherubini, Mozart. Which one has the most impact, and with which you connect the most amongst all the requiems out there?
I would say the Brahms Requiem gives me a huge amount emotionally. The Mozart's Requiem, even in the different versions, you know, even with all the questions and it's imperfect, the power of the sort of idea behind it, that this force of nature, one of the most extraordinary creatures that have ever existed, one of the most extraordinary minds, that this was kind of the last thing that we have from him. That always bowls me over. You know, if you love Mozart, you can't hear that piece without being, you know, hit in the heart. Particularly the Lacrimosa. You know, we know that those were the last bars that he wrote. Yeah. And when it gets to that point, I always shed a tear. But for pure power, the Verdi knocks audiences out. It always knocks audiences out. So
it's great to sing. It's a great piece, you know, for the singers. Singers love to sing the Verdi.
And in terms of spectacle, I mean, the Britten War Requiem is an extraordinary spectacle. It's a more difficult piece for people to access, I think. That's a piece that needs an audience member to spend a bit of time with beforehand, maybe getting into the texts, thinking about the context. But you have a chamber orchestra, a symphony orchestra, soloists, a big choir, a children's choir, you know, it's a spectacle. So my answer, right, you need an answer. For impact, probably Verdi, and for me, probably Brahms.
Wonderful. We have Andrew, who's asking, and you may have the answer because I don't have that answer. I speak in the video about the timpani malfunction when at one of the premiere, the timpani played too loud throughout. If it was caused by insufficient rehearsal time or because Brahms was not present. My understanding is that the part was wrong, but I'm not sure. Maybe you know.
It's such a great question because every time I hear that story, it's a famous story, I think, did the timpanist just turn up for the performance? And because the alternative is that they rehearsed it and he went the whole way through and no one said anything, which is unimaginable. So I think it's a really great question. And it's the same question I ask myself. And I'm afraid I don't have the answer.
Maybe he had too much red wine.
I wonder sometimes if it's one of those stories that's become, you know, legend, and maybe
exactly.
Or maybe, and I hate to tell you this as a chorus master, maybe the chorus didn't sound great and Brahms went.
That's a good solution. So if you ever do that, we'll know why. Lovely. We get a question from Maggie here talking about, do you see any connection about Brahms' childhood that was rather difficult, and maybe his personality that came after and evolved after in his life?
I mean, I suppose we're all the construct of our childhoods. That's kind of something we're all trying to unpick at any particular time, or revel in, if you want to be more optimistic about it. He had a very strange childhood. Yeah, a lot of people do. A lot of people have very strange lives. If you think about what was going on in Bach's life, he had children running around absolutely everywhere. I don't know how he found time to work. For almost all of these composers from that era and before, death was a part of daily life. People died very young. People died very often. So I think he was the sum of those parts. And in contrast to Bach, as I mentioned earlier, and in contrast, I think, to Mozart, I sense in studying Brahms the process involved. Even though he's undoubtedly one of the very greats, Mozart and Bach, it just flowed out of them. When we talk about gift, in terms of pure gift, they had something otherworldly. There's no question about it. The amount of time it would take to write out what Mozart wrote, just to copy it, it takes about the same time it took him to write it. I mean, that's been figured out before. It's just he wrote it like a tap had been turned on. And so I think Brahms did spend a lot of time thinking about his music and how to construct it and how to say what he wanted to say, which leads me to believe that perhaps he did the same thing about life. He had some unusual habits, and he had some unusual experiences as a child. You read lots of different things. It's difficult to know the absolute truth, but I'm sure that his childhood played into what he wrote. And at the same time, I believe that his music endures because he found a way to put aside the personal and in his music connect to something that is universal. It's very difficult to hear the opening bars, whatever culture you're from, whatever age you're in, you are, without feeling something happening. It was funny earlier when, and I was watching the video you prepared, my little boy ran in, and the music was playing, and he's just running around the whole time at the moment. And he came and he stopped and he just listened. And I remember thinking, doesn't matter. People think that Brahms is for older people, but it's not. It grabs anybody. It's just music that is otherworldly. So, yeah.
This is wonderful. I mean, clearly, as you mentioned, the human part of Brahms really transfer in his Requiem, making his Requiem fully human. And that's wonderful. I think that's almost all the time we have, and we answered pretty much all the questions. If we didn't get to your question, we are sorry, but we'll have a chance next time. But it was so great to have you with us tonight, Alexander. We really hope we'll be able to make music with you. I'm speaking on behalf of all the singers in Ottawa who are really hoping that we'll get to be in the NAC at some point soon and perform together.
It's a tragedy how singing particularly has been affected and bearing the brunt of this worldwide, and I hope that very quickly we find a solution to that. But can I thank you and the whole Ottawa Choral Society? I think this is such a great idea. It's so interesting for me. I loved your video. I love also the other links that you sent through. They're really great. But your work is always extraordinary. When you're preparing the choruses, it's immaculate. Dwayne Wolf, whom you're interviewing next, he speaks in the highest terms, and he really, really, really has seen it all. So thank you for everything you do, and thank you for having me on as a guest. It's a real privilege.
Thank you so much. Maybe next time we meet, we'll be on a stage doing Brahms Requiem all together. Let's cross fingers. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, everybody who's joining us on YouTube. We'll see you next month. And Dwayne will be with us, Dwayne Wolf, talking about Beethoven's Missa Solemnis next month. Thank you again. See you next time.